Alright, so I want to talk about weight and boxing. You know, I talk a lot about weight in boxing, and this time I'm going to talk about weight as you move up in weight, as you move down in weight, and weight divisions. Now, it's commonly thought that the heavyweight division is the greatest division in boxing, and I can understand the perspective of people who think that way. However, when someone thinks that a heavyweight or a great heavyweight even would automatically beat everyone in the lower weight classes, I think that they are not really factoring in a number of different things. Usually what they're thinking about is the power and the strength of a heavyweight. That's why they would win fights. But power and strength is not enough to win a fight in boxing. So let's get into it. So if you move up in weight, if you move up from one division to the next in weight, one thing that is going to happen with you is you're going to gain some strength and you're going to gain some power. Okay? Because you're going to put on more size. Now it depends on what individual you are, but nonetheless, generally speaking, that's what happens. But you will sacrifice some of your speed and your quickness because you've put on more size, generally speaking. If you're moving down in weight, you will sacrifice your strength and your punching power for speed and quickness. So some of your strength and punching power you had in the higher weight class, it's going to go down a bit, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you won't knock out people at a low weight class, because the other factor is this. If you're moving down in weight, it means that the punch resistance of fighters as you move down in weight actually decreases. And you may be the person who actually is tougher and stronger than the smaller guys. Well, it depends on how you lose your weight and all of those other things, and how you rehydrate back to your normal weight. If you're moving up in weight, then the very opposite applies. Where guys are stronger there, they can take punches much better there. So even though you've increased in power and in strength, you're meeting guys who have already had greater power and strength all along. So you have to acclimatize to a higher weight division. But you will have a speed advantage over those guys, generally speaking. Now, if you look at these two individuals here to the right of the screen, this is a very good example of what I'm talking about. If you look, this gentleman here, his name is Primo Carnera, and this gentleman here, his name is Frankie Gennaro. Now, Frankie Gennaro, he was a IBU and NBA flyweight champion of the world. All right, 5'2", very small little guy. And Primo Carnera, he was the heavyweight champion of the world in the 1930s. And the thing about Primo Carnera is he's about 6'5", as you can see. So Primo Carnera, if he was to fight Frankie Gennaro, he would have the height advantage, the size advantage, the strength advantage, and the power advantage. Whereas Frankie Gennaro would have the quickness advantage and the speed advantage. While Primo Carnera could end the fight with one punch, that's if he can catch Frankie Gennaro. So you have to think about those different factors that we're talking about if these two were to fight one another as they are, size for size. Another thing people take for granted is just because someone has all the advantages, reach and so on, it doesn't necessarily mean that that guarantees them a win of a fight. Now, if you ever seen Primo Carnera fight, you will see that Primo Carnera, he fights a lot like Vladimir Klitschko does today. And he makes use of the jab, he fights behind his jab. Okay, and then he lands the straight right after the jab. Frankie Gennaro, he's a quicker, faster boxer. Okay, being a flyweight, he would move around the ring a lot. He had a lot of foot movement, and he could box. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because, one, if you've ever watched any fights from Primo Carnera, he generally was good at keeping range, keeping distance, throwing his combinations in close, but usually creating distance to do that, tying up his opponent once in close. And he was able to beat Jack Sharkey the second time around, knocking him out. But he was susceptible to the punch combinations that most people in boxing who are boxers are susceptible to, with very few exceptions, which is the left hook. He was open for that. Once you slip under his jab and you come up with the left hook or leaping left hook, he gets caught with it every single time. And the other thing was, if you could time his jab properly, just like Joe Louis did, you could counter over his jab and actually hit him with an overhand right flushly, as Joe Louis did. And Joe Louis, of course, was much shorter, and he had a shorter reach. So, size, reach, power, strength advantage doesn't necessarily equate to a win. So for those people who talk about heavyweights, being able to beat every single fighter because they're smaller than them, I don't necessarily agree with that. I'll give you another example. Roy Jones Jr. He moved up from light heavyweight and he fought John Ruiz, who was the heavyweight champion of the world, and he was able to beat him. He wasn't able to knock him out. He didn't have that power. He didn't have that strength to do that. But he was able to easily outbox him, mainly because he would have had the speed advantage. It would be the much faster guy in there and quicker guy in there. And so he was able to beat John Ruiz. But this guy, he was campaigning at light heavyweight. Let me give you another example of where weight doesn't necessarily equal to a win. I'm going to go the opposite direction. You look at Roy Jones Jr., heavyweight champion of the world, he moved down in weight to light heavyweight, right? He fought Antonio Tarver. Now, you would think, since he's come from a higher weight class, that going down to a lower weight class, he would actually be stronger than Antonio Tarver, be able to stop him. He would not be as fast as Antonio Tarver, even though he would be quick, but he would be able to keep up with Antonio Tarver, and if he was to land a punch, he probably would stop Antonio Tarver. Now, in his rematch with Antonio Tarver was the one that stopped Roy Jones Jr. He knocked him out cold. And the point behind this is this, that just because you go down in a weight class doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to knock out the people in that weight class. It could be that you actually, because you've moved down in weight and because you've become weaker, you actually could compromise your own self and get knocked out. So it doesn't necessarily equate either way, right? Same guy, Roy Jones Jr., moved up in weight. He had advantages over John Ruiz. Moved down in weight, he had disadvantages against Antonio Tarver, which seems strange, but this is the way how fighting can be. I'll give you another example where someone moved down in weight and yet they won a fight. Sean Porter, very recent example against Adrian Broner. In that case, Sean Porter, he never lacked energy, he never lacked strength. He generally, most of the time through the fight, he had strength. Of course, he did fade a little bit coming to the end of the fight. And that was the lowest he'd ever gone in his life to make weight in a boxing match. So my point is this. Just speaking about the size of someone or even the power of someone does not guarantee them a win. So you can't say blanketly that if a heavyweight was to fight, say a middleweight, that he would win. You have to look at a number of different factors besides just size and reach and height and power. I think a lot of people lose focus on that. And a number of times, even though we have weight divisions, and rightfully so, to level the playing field, a lot of people ignore other factors such as ring IQ, smarts, quickness, speed, styles, because styles make fights. So all of these things you must put into consideration when you think about these things. You guys have a great one.